So this is my next quote, taken primarily, I think, from, from a data science journal. And the point made there was, yes, we can talk about building models with algorithms. We can have a lot of fun stuff doing that. But actually, a very large proportion of the time spent in doing that is going to be actually getting the data. Finding the data, cleaning the data, organizing the data, thinking through what types of data you can really use and what you should throw aside. It's really worthwhile remembering that, because the actual model building process can happen remarkably quickly. But this puts it in perspective. So in this session, I'm going to walk you through a workflow that is the way that the use of LC3 is structured, and through some prediction modeling issues associated with each step of that workflow, which are not specific to LC3 but are more generic. So this is the LC3 web page, and the link to it is up on the right there. And this web page describes in great detail, through a series of drop-down menus, what happens at every stage of the workflow. And I recommend, if you're interested in finding out more about this particular app, that you go there and explore this. But basically, it's a relatively simple workflow. We're moving from the left to the right, but you'll notice some faint feedback loops whereby, having got to a certain point, you decide you need to go back and revise how you did something at an earlier stage. And one of those is a feedback loop, and we move from basically what is a cross-case analysis in the early stage towards identifying what individual cases we want to look at. And at that point in time, and through that within-case investigation, that may come back and cause us to re-examine the original data set and perhaps redo the analysis in a slightly different way. So that's the sort of workflow that we're going to walk through. And I'll have to make a judgment about how much detail to give in the time available. So I suspect I will be brushing over some things too quickly, in which case, just if that worries you, bring that up when we get to the point of discussion. So this is the first stage of the process. It's pretty simple. Basically, you cut and paste a data set in there, in this screen, and the data set has three types of data. An ID column on the left. In this case, there are 26 African countries. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns describing attributes of those countries. And there's no limit to the number of columns. This is one particular example data set built into the app, and it's from a study by Crook on the factors affecting levels of women's representation in Parliament in Africa. And on the right-hand side, there's an outcome column describing whether the levels of women's participation are high or low. Some of these columns are basically intrinsically binary data. Is the voting system proportional or not? Are there quotas for women or not? Is the country in a post-conflict state or not? But others are numerical data that's been dichotomized. The level of human development, which is a UNDP index, women's status, which I think is another index, and the percentage of women in national parliament, which is obviously a percentage which has been dichotomized. And those choices were made by the author of the paper, where to dichotomize. But obviously they raise big questions about how and when do you dichotomize, and perhaps that's something we can talk about in the discussion. So the data set is binary. That's the raw material that we're working with. It can be as long and as wide as you'd like in principle, but in practice, not, and we'll come to that. You start off with a blank canvas. You can cut and paste your own data set in there, or you can work with a sample data set, and we'll be using this sample data set as we walk through here, just for simplicity's sake. And you walk the process across following the chevrons on the left, and that moves the data with you as you've processed it, but you can walk backwards using the tabs at the bottom. So this is the next stage where, having put in a data set, you're going to make some analytical decisions about, you might have more than one column of outcome data that you originally entered. That's quite okay. And you might have lots of different attributes, and that's okay. But the data that you've got there, if you come as an evaluator, typically those columns will be informed by some prior theory of what is relevant. You know, what sort of outcomes that you're interested in analysing, and what sort of factors you think might be influencing those outcomes. So this data set, to me, constitutes what I like to describe a loose theory. We think these things are connected, but we actually haven't worked out exactly how they're connected, and that's one of the purposes of this sort of analysis. Has anyone here heard of something wonderfully called the curse of dimensionality? No. Okay. The curse of dimensionality is, if you've got two attributes, you've got 4 possible combinations of those that might be leading to an outcome. But if you add an extra attribute, you've got 8 possible combinations of those. And if you add another attribute, you've got 16. Another one, you've got 32. In this one, we've got 32 possible combinations. That's a lot of possible combinations that might be leading to the outcome. And straight away, you can think of a couple of problems. One, a hypothesis-based inquiry is just going to touch the edge of this problem. You need some way of searching all these possibilities rather than just manually working your way through every one of them. But the other possibility is that if you've got 10 attributes, so that's 2 to the power of 10 possible combinations, have you got enough cases there that will capture all that possible diversity? Or have you only got a few cases, in which case your data set only captures some of the possible configuration, the combinations that might be at work, and so any finding that you find in this analysis might be strictly limited to this data set and may not generalize very well. So there are 2 key issues at this stage of working when you're selecting what data to work with in the subsequent part of the analysis. The curse of dimensionality? Okay. Yeah, it's in Wikipedia. It's not my phrase. So there are important questions here at this stage of the analysis of deciding not only what outcome you want to analyse and what attributes you want to analyse, but do you have too little diversity? And that might be a concern if you want to generalise your findings, or you may not be worried about generalising. You may that may not be an issue. You may be more concerned about the internal validity of your findings, in which case what you're going to be looking for is a second measure here called consistency, and that's looking at, you've got 3 cases, they've all got the same attributes, but one of them has got a different outcome. So that's an inconsistent configuration, and that's a problem when you come to developing a predictive model, because it'll be trying to predict the outcome for those cases, but they've got exactly the same attributes, but there's a different outcome. So there are ways and means of addressing that problem, but ideally we want to try and minimize both the consistency and diversity, minimize the inconsistency and maximize the diversity of your data set. But it depends on your concern about internal validity versus external validity. A strong explanation of what exists already versus trying to project the findings elsewhere to some useful purpose. And up on the top there, you'll find 2 buttons. One is sort by configurations, and that enables you to quickly spot where the inconsistent configurations are. But the other one says, yeah, I can't even read it, find optimal attributes. And this actually uses a search algorithm to find the combination of attributes which will maximize both diversity and consistency. This is a little bit of icing on the cake. It's not essential for you can use this without using that algorithm, but I like to think that it's one of the more individual aspects of this program that some others don't have. So we've got to the point where we've decided we're going to work with all the attributes and the single outcome here, because it's not a very complex data set. And so we click on the Design and Evaluate worksheet up the top. And this is where we come to the sort of the engine room of this app. And it's basically got 3 sections. One is a design section on the left, an evaluate section, and an explore section. And in the design section, it's basically like a restaurant menu. Up the top, you click whether you want to investigate the percentage of women in Parliament as present or absent. That's a rather mechanical way of describing high or low. So you want to develop a predictive model of where the level is high or where the level is low, remembering the notion of asymmetric causation, that you might need to develop a different model for when it's low compared to when it's high. And then underneath that are a list of attributes, those other fields, and you can click on each of those to click 1, present, 0, absent, or NA, which means it doesn't really matter. And so when you did that, like on a menu, you're choosing that you're manually designing your model. This is your hypothesis-led inquiry. You've got a mental model of the key attributes that make a difference, and you put them in there, and it'll immediately search and show you some results up here, which I'll explain in a second. But let me just have a quick scan around here. If anyone would like to sort of table a hypothesis about what will predict high levels of women's representation in African 26 countries in Africa. Will it be having a proportional electoral system, proportional voting electoral system? Will it be the presence of quotas for women? Will it be women having high levels of high status? Will it be a high level of human development, or will it be the country being in a post-conflict situation, or some combination of these? Anybody like to hazard a guess? Yeah, but, okay, but what combination? Women's status and level of human development? We might, if we have time later on, actually plug this in and see how it works, but I actually mentally know the answer. Women's status and high level of women development. Any other suggestions? Quotas, okay. Post-conflict situation. Any others? It's interesting that one of you has gone for 2 factors, the other, each of you have gone for single factors. I can tell you the answer is a combination of 2, and we may come to that later on, but I will let you in as we go along. But obviously, we bring to this data some prior idea of what is a plausible theory, and we can manually test it. So up on the top, we've got what's called and this is another unfortunate name, it's called a confusion matrix. It's actually a truth table combining the possibilities, 4 possibilities, that the attributes of the model are present, that's the top row. The next row, the attributes of the model are absent. And the left column is the data says the outcome is present, and the data says the outcome is absent. And in this, because I haven't put a model in here, this is not a very good example, but in each of those cells, it's telling us, the top one on the top left is called true positive. It's how many cases have the attributes of the model and do have the outcome present. So it's a true positive. The next one, the false positive, is these cases have the attributes of the model, but the outcome is not present. Then we've got false negative, where the attributes of the model are not present in these cases, but the outcome is present. And then we've got the last one, true negative, where the attributes of the model are not present in these cases, but the outcome is not present either, which is fine. So based on that matrix there, and a confusion matrix you can search on Wikipedia. It's used in a lot of areas, primarily for classification type prediction exercises rather than numerical ones like using regression analyses. But down the bottom here are a number of performance measures, model performance measures, which use the data from the confusion matrix. And the simplest one is accuracy, which is simply calculating the percentage of all the cases which are true positive and true negative. The percentage of the cases where the attributes were present and the outcome was present, and the attributes were absent and the outcome wasn't present. So that's very simple. But then there are a lot of other more sophisticated measures, and if you click on the question mark button or look at the formula button, it'll tell you how they work, and then you can do a Google search of those as well. So, okay, that's a manual hypothesis testing. But if we go over to the right-hand side, and I'll just see whether I've got a slide for this. And if we click on that top orange button, which says most predictive of any kind, basically we've got this pop-up menu which is giving us at the top 4 different search algorithms which are going to do the manually tedious work of looking through different combinations and finding out which one is a good predictor of the outcome that we're interested in. And there are 4 types of search here. One is called exhaustive search or brute force search, which literally generates all the possible combinations and then tests every one. You can imagine how time-consuming that would be to do manually. That's why we use computers. And the second one uses a genetic algorithm, and I don't use this very often, and I can explain this a bit more later, but I won't now. And the other one is a very simple one. It just scans through the list of 5 attributes and finds the best performing one, just a single attribute. But having done that, that then says, do you want to do this a second time and find another attribute which we add to the first one and which might improve that? So it incrementally builds up a model 1 attribute at a time. And the third one is called a decision tree model, which doesn't find just one model that's a good predictor, but a package of models which account for all the outcomes using this third type of search strategy. And below that, we've got a choice of the value to optimize. That's the performance measure we want to use to help it assess how good the model is. So I put in accuracy there, the measure I've just explained to you before. And then down below, we've got the option of setting various constraints that we might want to make this model fit. And I won't go into those except to say that you can make it search for model attributes which are sufficient. In other words, they will deliver the outcome, but there are other ways of getting there. Or you might want to set a constraint which says, I want these model attributes to be necessary. In other words, whatever way that's used to achieve that outcome, it's always going to have to achieve these, have to include these elements. So you can put these constraints in there to limit the search towards this type of model that you want to find. And you can even say, I want to find a model with no more than 4 attributes or no more than 3 attributes. So I thought I should answer this question. Does machine learning, is eval-C3 using machine learning? And in a very simple sense, yes. And it has these elements. There is a systematic search process that finds a set of attributes that may be a good predictor of the outcome of interest. It has an evaluation function which assesses that. It then stores that. Then it redoes the search again, and if it finds a better one, it replaces that with the new value. And it keeps doing that until it can't find any better ones. That's as complex as it gets. Right, so if we've developed a number of models manually, using that manual on the left-hand side or using the algorithmic search on the right-hand side, we will end up with an archive listing all the models that we've found. And with manual models, we have to save them ourselves, but with the ones generated by algorithms, they're automatically saved. And so we've got all these different models looking at things from different angles. But having done that, we can either reload a particular model to look at it in detail, because while that row describes the model in great detail, it's totally un-user-friendly. On the other hand, we might want to look inside that particular model and see what cases are covered by it in great detail, and that's where we'll click on View Cases, which we'll come to shortly. Or we might want to select 2 models that seem to be performing very well, and we want to load them both at the same time and compare how they work. And I think that's the next slide. Compare the cases they cover. Oh, I've jumped a little bit. I'll come back to that slide in a minute. So this is where we're comparing 2 cases. 3 models, and those beige colorings are saying these are the true positive cases identified by each of the models, and down the bottom we've got some data on the percentage of all the true positives that each model covers. Now the important point here is if you've got 2 models that are overlapping the cases that they're covering, you've got redundant models. You've got to make a choice about which of these models you think is the most useful one, particularly if you're searching for explanatory models. So one thing that automatically suggests is, well, we better focus in on those cases that are covered by 2 or 3 models, because if, for example, Namibia here is covered by 3 models, And they can't all be right. So let's look at Namibia and what we know about Namibia and see whether we can use that to resolve, whether we can find some extra thing going on there that helps clarify what's going on. We might even include that extra attribute back in our data set. But I'm going to go back now to this whole question of when you start looking within cases, why you might be doing that. So there are basically 4 reasons that I seem to have collected over the years or time. The first is one might want to look into an individual case simply to be able to use it for illustrative purposes. It's one thing to say, and the correct answer is, the presence of quotas and a country being in a post-conflict situation is the best predictor of high levels of women's representation in Parliament. It's one thing to say that, but it's another thing to then show here is a real-life example of a country that has these attributes and this is what's happened. So you're putting flesh. Sorry, beg your pardon. It's one thing to say that the presence of quotas and a country being in a post-conflict situation is associated with high levels of women's representation in Parliament, but it's another thing to be able to actually show here is a country, a specific country, and this is exactly what happened and how those things manifested themselves. So just for illustrative purposes alone, for communication purposes, within case analysis can be quite useful. Secondly, when you do that, you might discover that the decision to classify this country as being in a post-conflict situation is questionable. Maybe the coding was wrong here. So what you're doing effectively is verifying whether the original coding of the attributes of that case study were correct or not. And then thirdly, and probably very importantly, you're starting to look into that case to find out, well, how was it that being in a post-conflict situation and quotas led to high levels of women's representation in Parliament? What actually happened? What's the details of the story that connected these things? Did quotas arise because there were high levels of women fighting in an army during the Civil War and they were sufficiently sort of empowered to demand quotas at the parliamentary level? Or was it foreign donors who came into a weakened country and imposed their own sort of particular preferences? So you'd be looking at, in that case example, to try and find a storyline that's connected these observed things that have been associated with each other. And finally, looking inside a case is important in terms of finding contradictory information, the classic confounding variable. There might be some other factor outside the data set which has led to quotas being used in this post-conflict situation, but it had nothing to do with the combination of those two things. They were both somehow connected with some third-party event. So we've covered this here. This is the last panel, part of the workflow diagram, where we see how the cases are organised in terms of their confusion matrix categories: true positive, true negative, false negative. There were no false positive ones in this example. And we've got 2 buttons at the top there which we can press, which are helpful in terms of case selection. The first one helps us identify within a particular category which cases were more similar and more different. There's a measure called Hamming distance which enables you to compare 2 strings of zeros and ones. And with that, we can find countries in the true positives which are modal cases. In other words, they're most similar to every other case in that group, and they'd be a good case for us to look at because they don't have any distracting, unusual features. On the other hand, we can identify a case which is most different within that group because it's got all these odd attributes. Now, if we find a causal mechanism working in the modal case, and then we go and look at the outlier case, and we find the causal mechanism also working there despite all these other extraneous differences, it gives us a bit more confidence that that causal mechanism might be the explanation behind this association that we're looking for. It's not proof, it's just a stronger form of evidence. We can also click on the compare button up there, which will enable us to nominate a particular country and then find the most similar and most different country if we want to make other forms of case selection across the categories in the confusion matrix. I'm a bit running short of time on this one, so That's just illustrating, I've there selected, which country have I selected? I think I've selected the country at the top, and the green bars are the most similar, and the orange are the least similar. But I've already talked about that. I think I will end just very briefly. Yeah. So for each of those categories in the confusion matrix, we can identify different strategies for within-case investigations, questions that we might want to ask to help us clarify what's going on. In the true positives, as I've mentioned already, trying to find a modal case and then the causal mechanisms at work there, and then an outlier case to see whether those same mechanisms were still at work. Then if we look at false positives, these are where the model attributes are present but the outcome is not. So what should we look for there? We might look for some other attribute, not in the data set, which is functioning as a sort of blocking event, some sort of blocking factor. It's not in the true positives, but it is in the false positives, and it's stopping the outcome from taking place when otherwise we would expect it to happen. Or we might find that there are other enabling attributes outside the data set which are in the true positives cases, but not in the false positive ones. So both these questions are getting us to look outside, when we look inside the cases, getting us to look outside the existing data set that we've got. If we look at the false negatives, there are a couple of possibilities here. One is that, okay, these cases don't have exactly the same attributes as those in the true positives, but there might be something else, some extra attribute there that's enabling that outcome to happen. So it's the association is not there, but there's something extra. Or there might be cases there which actually have all the attributes of the model, but our data set says that bit of data is missing. So it's got 3 out of the 4 attributes of the model, and the other one is missing simply because the data is missing, and the missing data is an issue often. And there might also be some cases which are simply not covered by any model that would be worth looking at. I should make a point here about missing data in this data set. In this type of analysis, if there's a cell which has no value, neither 0 nor 1, when it's searching to find whether a particular combination of attributes is a good predictor, it will treat the absence as, it'll treat it as the opposite. How can I say? If it was looking for the presence of quotas and the presence of post-conflict situation, if it discovered a blank cell for post-conflict situation in a country, it would treat it as not being a post-conflict country. So it treats absence of data as the opposite of what the model is consisting of. So it ends up producing a conservative model. Where absent data is present, it produces conservative models. So we know where the bias lies. The last one I want to look at is looking at true negatives. It might be there that we find cases which have all but one of the attributes of the model, but that missing attribute has actually made a huge difference between the outcome occurring or not occurring. In QCA terms, this is covered by this very awkward term called I-ness. There are some attributes of the model which, when they're taken away, don't just make a small difference to the performance of the model, but throw it from achieving the outcome to not achieving the outcome. So they, as a particular causal influence, can be particularly important and worth looking at. I think we've come to the end and we've got some time for questions. Oh, theory summary, quickly, very quickly. So theory-led and data-led inquiries can happen in the same way through that panel. We can manually construct our own menus, but we can also use algorithms to search for better fitting models outside our own mental framework. You can use more than one search algorithm, and I've done this frequently. Within case inquiries can serve multiple purposes, and there are a range of case selection strategies that you can pursue, and that cross-case and within-case analyses should inform each other. So your original knowledge of all these cases will inform your selection of the attributes which are in the data set, I'm sure. But in turn, going through this analysis and doing the within-case analysis, you might come up with new attributes which are not in the data set, but which you think we really need to include this in the data set because it's made a difference in this case, so we should put it we should tabulate it for all those other countries and rerun the analysis to see whether it makes a difference to our prediction models. Right, I'll stop there, and we've got at least 5 minutes for questions.